I'd like to look at a somewhat different example about our appetite for deception, which is the world of robots and whether robots have minds. And again, this is something I've been interested in for quite some time. And though it's become increasingly newsworthy in the last couple of years, and you're seeing a lot of stories now about AI and when will AIs become intelligent enough to actually really have feelings? Is that possible? And we're also seeing a lot of robot-like things in the home. So it's a issue that has been sort of a big philosophical question, I mean, certainly for a long time. You can look back to the stories of the golem. But in 1950, Alan Turing, who was he's sort of the father of computer science, wrote a somewhat more speculative paper in a philosophy journal called Mind on the question of whether computers could ever be intelligent. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Turing Test, which is whether you can tell if a computer is human or not. And that is a test that he devised because he pretty quickly into his paper said, well, the question of whether machines can think is meaningless. We really can't see if they're thinking. You can't look in another's mind. So we're going to replace it with a behavioral test where if you have a computer that is typing answers, or it might be a computer, it might be a person, it's behind, it's just, you're just seeing typed answers, you ask it questions. If the computer is able to fool you into thinking it's human when you're not sure whether your answers are being made by a computer or a human, once there's a computer who can fool you into thinking you're human, then we need to say that computers can think. A few years after he wrote this, a computer scientist named Weizenbaum at MIT wrote a program called ELIZA. And ELIZA was a chatbot, and this is an example of how ELIZA functions. There's versions of ELIZA that are online today. You can try it yourself. And ELIZA described herself as a psychotherapist. You can type things at her, and you get some kind of reaction back. Now, this was made in 1963, and Weizenbaum did not make this in order to fool people. He made it in order to show that the Turing test was not a good substitution for the question, can machines think? So, the type of computer that he was using to get this sort of dialogue going, is probably, it's not even equivalent to your phone. It's probably like in your watch today. But what he wanted to show was that something that was very simple, it was essentially just a sentence parser, could give the illusion of being a person very, very easily. And that, and in particular, if you give it the right framing, this one introduced itself as a psychologist. And for that, that gave an excuse for basically being a parser that took your sentences and had a few sets of rules for how to turn your question into a different question, or your answer into another question. But as a so-called psychotherapist, that might seem believable. And so his intention was that people would see this and they would say, oh, you're right, this is not a good way to judge machine intelligence. Forget about that. That was not at all the reaction that he got. One of the things he wrote up afterwards was that his secretary, who had watched him programming this, knew how it worked. When she tried it, asked him to leave the room because she wanted to talk to it. And then other people took the program up and said, this is wonderful. We can now use machines as psychotherapists instead. This is great. Everyone can have their own robot therapist. Weizenbaum was so dismayed by this reaction that he stopped working in the field of computer science entirely and he was a full professor at MIT, but devoted the rest of his career there to writing about basically the dangers of the dehumanization that technology could cause. And that this was an example, that this was so disturbing because it was an example of us being so willing to turn over to something that was clearly a machine, and to see our humanity as being so machine-like, and to discard the value of anything such as empathy in a relationship, just for the experience of getting the words right. This is the program behind, part of the program behind ELIZA. What's interesting is that this is some research that's going on today. You can add some avatars in, etc. But this is work that's now being done with trying to make systems that in many ways are very similar. They essentially they're more sophisticated parsing systems, but they certainly aren't empathic in any way. But to make, in this case, therapists for veterans, where they have so many veterans who need psychotherapy. One of the, it's research work and saying, well, if people can be treated by a computer that can appear to be empathic, it's much cheaper. They can afford it. Is it better than nothing? And so part of the questions I just want to raise here are, we can take Weizenbaum's stand and say, this is terrible, it's unethical, actual empathy is really important. Trying to fool people into thinking they're talking to something that cares about them is morally wrong. We can take the view of the people who are making this, many of whom feel that they are serving humanity very well, that they're saying, well, therapy is very, very important. A lot of people can't afford it. There's not enough people to go around. If we can make a system that gives people, even if it, at some level they know they're talking to a machine, but it's easy to get caught up into relating to it and to feel that it is really paying attention to you, even if at some level it isn't quite doing that. And it's helpful. If it's helpful, it's just helpful, and that's where the underlying ethics come in. So we should be doing stuff like this, and we should be making this sort of thing available to people. And then there are a number of other questions to ask about what's the different, what is the role of empathy in this type of experience? I once gave a talk about this to an audience of psychotherapists, which was very interesting. And one of the questions was, what do we know? What does the patient know about what is going on in the mind of the therapist? What is our sense of the truth and falseness in that relationship? Because on the ideal end, the patient is sitting and talking to somebody who is deeply empathic and thinking of them. But on the other hand, what if the patient is actually sitting there talking to somebody who's thinking to themselves, oh my God, do I have to listen to this person whine about this again and again and again? I'm so tired of listening to them. When will this hour be over? So even that question of empathy doesn't simply stop by saying, there is a human here. Somebody who finds that very self-conscious experience or excruciating, or is very insecure and is always afraid that that's the reality, might feel much more comfortable talking to a robot. So that would be a much better solution for them. So there are a number of questions here in terms of what are the ethics behind the different technologies that induce us to have some kind of personal relationship with something that can talk to us in a human-like way.